Hello, everybody. My name is Gareth Wiltshire, coming to you from Loughborough University in the UK. So it's my first time at a philosophy conference, so please be nice. Tend to publish more in sociology, often related to physical activity and health. But I do have a connection to this particular topic, and I thought, why not come to Split and try and make some new friends. So what is this paper generally about? The fun topic of sport and death. So hopefully it's going to be fairly serious, but hopefully light as well, as you'll see as I talk. So more specifically, it's about connecting Heidegger's being towards death with a particular type of sporting event, the transplant games. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But transplant games and events, just to have a brief idea, are multi-sport, Olympic-style games for people who've had an organ transplant. And I think this can be looked at with the help of Heidegger. So death is an important consideration in existentialist philosophy generally, but is perhaps most explicitly accounted for in Heidegger's being towards death. For Heidegger, an awareness of one's own mortality is fundamental to the human condition. When confronted by this, we are compelled to grapple with the meaninglessness of our own existence when we start to think about death in moments of reflection. And yet, Heidegger argues that the response to this confrontation is ultimately liberating, prompting a disruption to our stable, comfortable sense of being, and offering the possibility of living a more authentic life. So, sport and death in the literature, though. So I haven't done an extensive literature review, but looking in the obvious places reveals to me that it hasn't been explored extensively. And perhaps this isn't surprising. So sport is seen as a kind of a healthy, life-extending kind of medicinal activity for public health. And the vast majority of sport happens in early and midlife. So when death and sport have been brought together, I think it's been fruitful and interesting, however. So in the cases that you can see on the screen there, in the book edited by Mike McNamee, death was brought up in several chapters. So Breivik, McNamee and Krein all talked about death, but all in relation to the risk of death in extreme sports, maybe out in nature, maybe adventurous activities. This theme of death as a risky activity is taken through to Breivik's article on skydiving, the second one on the list there. As a Heideggerian analysis, this one was important for me, opening some of the existentialist ideas that I'll talk about later. But for Breivik, when a novice skydiver takes his or her first skydive, the experience is a perfect example of anxiety and a disconnection with the world. And in this anxiety, we become aware of our own finitude and our own being towards death. Tunstall also uses Heidegger, but in this paper, death is really used as a metaphor for defeat or injury. So this represents for Tunstall something like a small version of death. So if you're defeated or if you have an injury, it's not death exactly, but it's a metaphor. So for Tunstall, this still works just as well, even though death is metaphorical, because the important thing is that sport provides an opportunity to confront the possibility of defeat. A competition entails the possibility of defeat, even though you're trying to win, just as living entails the possibility of death, even though you're trying to survive. Patrick Findler discusses the case of a mountain climber who died climbing Everest, and 40 climbers walked past him and didn't attempt to save his life. That's a kind of moral, ethical paper. More of a connection with the last paper with Pam Sellers. Death is raised in a slightly different way. It's more about aging and bodily decline. But the main connection for my interest is in this paper, what's raised is the world senior game, so kind of masters or veteran competitions, and what that means for adults experiencing a bodily decline. So overall then, what I'm saying is I think death hasn't been extensively explored in the philosophy of sport. When it has been, it's been connected to risky sports, and Heidegger has been used before, so I'm on fairly safe ground there. But all this to say that the present paper, I think, has some novelty, but it's not entirely isolated. So I got an idea of what we're talking about in terms of Heidegger, a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about death and sport in the literature, but the obvious other bit of background information I need to provide is about the transplant games. Most people probably haven't heard of the transplant games before. So as a brief overview of what it is, maybe keep the World Transplant Games in your mind. There are different versions. So there are regional games like European transplant and dialysis games, for example, or national level games like the British Transplant Games. But the World Transplant Games happens every 2 years. The most recent one was in Perth in Australia, where I went, and I was the athletics coach for the British team. So it has been kind of growing since the 1990s, and there's now about 2,500 participants traveling from over 60 countries to the Games. So maybe something, if you want to think about early versions of Paralympic Games, or maybe the Invictus Games as well, that might give you an idea. Of course, the event is about sport. It's about competing for medals, personal bests. But what I'm emphasizing today is that other aspects of the event that appear in the rituals, the rhetoric, the marketing materials, and the inescapable situation that these athletes are in as transplant recipients. Just a couple of other things to say about it. Many people like coming back to these games. They come back year after year. Some people describe that they would feel lost without the games, and it's talked about as a meeting place and something that's good for the spirit. So what are the obvious connections between sport, between the transplant games and death? So the connections I'd like to make at the beginning, at the outset, I think make it kind of fertile ground for this Heideggerian analysis. I think that most people who attend the games agree that they will notice and have moments of reflection because death is presented to people who attend the games. I'm going to attempt to play a short little clip, but I think it's not going to show up on the screen because it's connected to Zoom. So we're just going to have to listen to the audio here. This is an interview done by a participant at the games. The media picked up this particular person because he happens to be a coach for the British cycling team. But this is a participant talking about his experience of going to the games for the first time. Some feedback from faces around the room told me that you can't hear it. And I've tried to do all the volume, so I can't. Unfortunately, that audio is not going to work. Returning to the main presentation, I can kind of summarize what was being said there. Essentially, what I wanted to point out with that video was a moment when a participant started talking about the games and what it meant to him. And it was his first time attending, and he was asked a question about how do you feel about your donor. So obviously a thing for people who've had an organ transplant is many people have an organ given to them from a deceased donor, someone who's died. So in the moment he was asked about to think about that donor, he broke down in tears and found it very difficult to think about his own survival being reliant on the fact that somebody else had died. And that's quite a common thing, I think, to have a fairly obvious kind of emotional reaction for most people. So for me, that shows a little bit of a window into the things that concern, so our deepest concerns, our deepest issues, and our deepest things that make us feel that are very make sport quite meaningful in this particular event. So additionally, death reveals itself in the games in a number of other ways. So people are there to kind of raise awareness of organ donation. So you can see on the video on the right, the picture on the right as well. So people are encouraged to spread a message while they're at the games. When we're in Perth, you're walking around the shops, you can hear the radio adverts that came out, where as part of the games, people are trying to promote this idea that everyone in the public should also consider signing up to the organ donation register. So not only is it meaningful for participants, but also for the general public. You know, the outward-facing message of the games is one of asking people to reflect on the idea that you might die tomorrow. And that might be something that's quite different in this games to maybe other types of sporting events. So I'm going to connect these ideas with Heidegger, and the first a few quotes I'm going to use come from Being in Time, chapter 1, division 2. This is of the 2010 Jones Stambaugh translation, in case anyone wants to think about that. So the first point I'd like to make is that for Heidegger, life is incomprehensible without death. Das Sein entails its own opposite, das Nichts. So being there only makes sense insofar as we have an understanding of not being there. And this can be applied to being in general. So for a table to exist implies the possibility of a table not existing. But in the context of human experience, this not being is essentially mortality, death. And we see this as a relational definition to be different in kind to simple material objects. So even the objectively present corpse, if you want to imagine a deceased body, is, viewed theoretically, still a possible object for pathological anatomy whose understanding is oriented towards the idea of life. This something which is only just present is more than a lifeless material thing. In it, we encounter something unliving which has lost its life. So this is particularly poignant, I feel, with organ donation in mind, particularly from a deceased or cadaverous donor. A liver, a kidney, a heart is not merely a thing, it was once part of a living someone. So we have a sense of what death means, particularly when someone dies, and this means an end to the Dasein, which becomes objectively accessible. Though we cannot know death subjectively, we can only know being. So additionally, Heidegger points out the temporal nature of this relationality, so between being and not being, life and death. With a table either being there or not being there, temporality seems to me to be irrelevant. But for us, though, our being has this relationality to not being, but also has an axis of time. So this relationality becomes about being not yet. So in this sense, not only is death a condition for Dasein, but death is what gives Dasein its orientation, and this is a future orientation. Heidegger gives an example of a fruit and says the ripening fruit, however, is not only indifferent to its unripeness as another to itself, but ripening it is the unripeness. The not yet is already included in its own being, by no means an arbitrary determination, but as a constituent. A key difference from ripening fruit, of course, is that the future orientation of a ripening fruit is not the same as being towards death, because death can happen at any time. Indeed, while we almost certainly have a hope or concern for how far away death might be for us, I don't get the sense it's an important thing for Heidegger. Rather, in fact, it is coming at some point in the future is what matters. So the ending that we have in view when we speak of death does not signify being at an end of Dasein, but rather a being towards the end of this being. Yeah. Thank you. Death is a way of being that Dasein takes over as soon as it is. So as soon as a human being comes into life, they're old enough to die. So at Transplant Games events, I suggest these two relational aspects are brought to the fore. Being there in opposition to not being there is part of the rhetoric. Participants are encouraged to use the games as a way of saying thank you to their donor and donor families, because without this donation, they would not be here. Nevertheless, this brings into conscious awareness and produces moments of reflection about the very real possibility of not being alive. Indeed, people who are at the transplant games community pass away too. So at most sporting contests and competitions, it's quite common to maybe develop friendly rivalries between opponents. So imagine between Rafa Nadal and Roger Federer. But sometimes your competitor cannot compete due to injury. You might be looking forward to competing with them. At transplant games events, however, there's an added possibility that your rival can't compete due to a transplant-related illness, and sometimes, particularly in the older age groups, because of death. Such instances are mourned collectively and can serve as a reminder that it's not all plain sailing for transplant recipients. So this brings us on to anxiety, which for Heidegger is a part of Dasein but can emerge more prominently in these moments of reflection that I claim are part of the transplant games experience. So what does he mean by anxiety? Perhaps something slightly different to the kind of mental health medicalized word that we will use, that we tend to use in contemporary times. So anxiety is something that emerges when we feel a sense of unhomeliness in relation to the world. In the context of being an organ transplant recipient, anyone with a chronic health condition, this unhomeliness can be maybe applied to the double life that people lead. So the public-facing, going about the world where you engage with others, an everyday sense of the they self, and the more private, hidden engagement with one's own self. This second world with these health, is where these health practices exist. So like taking daily medication, arranging hospital visits, getting pricked by needles, regular blood tests, and a concern about one's future health status. I think this is a crucial part of the thrownness for Heidegger, what he refers to, or in other theory more generally, the circumstances that life enters us into without our own choosing. The illness journeys of transplant recipients almost all move from being healthy one day to feeling unwell, going to the doctors, and then needing a transplant in the future. So I think that's the kind of thrownness that can be applied here. So this anxiety, in my view, comes from the separation of the illusory, assumed to be healthy, normal they self way of being, and a transplantee way of being, which requires death is confronted more frequently at the transplant games. Are you ready to conclude? I am ready to conclude in 1 minute. So anxiety is about being in the world, and it's about simply being anxiety about death must not be confused with one's own demise, but arbitrary chance, a weak mood of an individual, but as a fundamental achievement of Dasein. So the final move is about authenticity in 45 seconds. Is essentially the idea that this unhomeliness, this Dasein, this awareness of death, which you're prompted to reflect out the games, brings about a moment of anxiety, and then you encounter an opportunity to live a more authentic life. So to kind of skip to the conclusion, I think this anticipation reveals this Dasein, its lostness in the they self, and brings it face to face with the possibility to be itself, primarily unsupported by concern that takes care, but to be itself on a passionate, anxious freedom towards death, which is free of the illusions that they face, factual uncertainty of itself. So from this framing, I think the games itself brings a performance of authentic choosing. As such, people didn't choose to fall ill, but they are choosing to take part in the games. So what to make of all this? I think Heidegger's being towards death, for me, provides a compelling explanation for why participants feel the way they do about the games. It means the games is less of a means to an end. They're not doing exercise to stay well or healthy. It's a way of finding meaning and living in that authentic place. And maybe why observers find it quite appealing too. So I think that Heidegger would have recommended the games, and he famously said that we should spend more time in graveyards. And while the transplant games is not a graveyard, certainly isn't, I think the sentiment of encouraging reflection remains. Sorry for going over time. Thank you very much.
Any questions? There are some Heidegger experts in this room. Ah, here.
Thank you very much for being of adding which in some ways that I guess at the end you connect the different style to authenticity, how these games kind of enhance that aspect. I think I agree with that. However, I think Heidegger, when he introduced authenticity in connection with there are two ways to look at death. Right? Not take one person, specific person dying. I have a very concern, like maybe past, right? And there's a logical sense. The first one is to do with anxiety. Then there's the idea of angst, right? Existential angst, which is about death as a general. Maybe we're not so long in dark room and night. So the idea is, well, actually, it seems to me that this is connected with the second one, the logical one. How do you connect these games, the differences to differences of death? Just not going to do well, having a cancer, I can live, I'm going to live, but it's just supporting the inevitable, right? And you say this brings me to the action. But that person was living an authentic life, I was just fearful of orgasms. Maybe worse, or that is so fragile, I'm getting in instead of boldly stepping out and trying to explore and so on. So could you maybe comment on how to connect with this game and then those levels with the games, maybe, Heidegger, or reverses?
Yeah, well, I think that's one to pick up afterwards. When I said be nice at the beginning, what I really meant was that I'm kind of looking to have these follow-up conversations with people who've read Heidegger a little bit more. So perhaps, yeah. So I'm not sure about how to answer that question really. I would say there's a tension with the transplant games in if I was going to put these questions to participants, I think a lot of people might talk about how it's a celebration of life. And I think, obviously you might maybe have to explain that life doesn't make any sense without death. Yeah, the how far away it is in the future is interesting. But the only other thing I'd say, I don't know whether it's connected or not, is that the celebration of life is past oriented, because they wouldn't be here had it not been for their transplant in the past. So they're thinking, maybe 10 years ago I had my transplant, and isn't it great that I'm still living in this future compared to that past. So in a way, that's interesting to think about time in that way, because it's not like people who haven't experienced that death at some point in the future. For them, it might be like, actually, I'm living in this is borrowed time in a way, or time that I didn't. I'm lucky to have. So,
Thanks. Adam, and another one here. Yeah.
Cheers, Gary. That was a really great presentation. Two really important topics. You actually introduced one question at the end of your answer there, which is something that I would have noticed who has appeared in the transplant games, is that actually it feels like for her life it's been very dense. And many times felt like you were going to die, and then you would almost return to compete again. And I think maybe some athletes feel this way with their careers, and retirement, feel they can never get that again. So they enter a new life. I just wonder, what your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and it reminds me of kidney transplant recipients in particular who might need multiple transplants over their life. So if it happens to you once, perhaps heart or lungs or liver might be kind of once in a lifetime kind of transplant, but kidneys kind of expect that at some point in the future they might need it. So yeah, it's interesting to think about that actually in kind of cycles. And I suppose the literature I was talking about earlier with Tunstall talking about death as a metaphor for injury or for defeat, that certainly works then, doesn't it? If you're confronting the possibility that you might need a transplant in the future, and in that confrontation, you're reflecting and doing something a little bit different. Interesting, thank you.
Thanks. We have two more. Jacob and Colin.
Thank you. So my understanding of the anxiety towards death is that it's pretty common for death science to flee to the other because death science fleeing its own uncanny using the word about some translation there. And so because death science tends to flee away from itself in anxiety because of that, death science has a tendency towards inauthenticity. And that's why I understand Heidegger to often be criticized, because the way then to maintain a sort of authenticity is to follow Heidegger's prescription for authenticity, which not many people know Heidegger. And the problem then also with that authenticity is we can't know then if someone's being authentic. They have to kind of basically follow Heidegger's prescription. And so how then can we say that we know that this sport competition is something that induces authenticity? It isn't something that is actually just kind of a reflection of inauthenticity, people fleeing from their experiences of death into the tranquility of being with others, the same experience.
Brilliant. I think before your question, I was probably thinking more that, yeah, on the side of assuming it would encourage more authenticity. But as you were talking, I'm thinking of the athletes and the competitors who kind of do go there and they are experiencing kind of new they self with other transplant recipients, and there's a kind of lots of kind of celebration and a new kind of identity, a new way of talking, which I can certainly see slipping into away from that authenticity in many respects. So yeah, thank you.
One kind.
There you go.
The last question, please.
Thanks, guys. I think it's such as a little bit on that, and the idea that once an event or an illness or something period of death happens to you, there's an expectation, it's a real reorganization of value priorities happens. So the question of information about the balance within the transplant games of previously excellent good athletes who don't want to give up what they were excellent at before. There's maybe somebody reorganize their values and get into sport and do something positive and that kind of stuff. And you think about Australia, it's a long way to go, away from farm for a long time. People worried about certain amount of health, choosing to go away from. So I don't want to a question, there's something about different farm habits and basically one something like this. People believe. I mean, I get cheese. I wonder to myself, I don't see it as healthy. I haven't changed the bit. Still a miserable sophisticated. But I know that people who seem radically changed, right? To be optimistic. So, there's no question that it is possible. And you give more information on the strength and value priorities. Are they elite athletes who want to achieve a career, do they fit well together? Is there a sense in which somebody who's world record holder at 1500 meters in the transplant games would be to get somebody? How do you? Sorry, very good.
Yeah, it's a diverse group of people. Probably wouldn't say there's many elite people who would do it. Andy Cole came to the British Games a couple of years ago. He's had a kidney transplant, but wouldn't compete. probably the standard isn't as developed. There are people who were competitive before their illness, and they're trying to use that to, because they probably haven't changed and they've got just a new context to do it, like you said. I think there are some people who it's really meaningful for the first time they go there, and then they go back to being their normal lives. So the first time is a kind of celebration of rehabilitation, in a way that I can now do things that I expect to be able to do, and I can kind of work towards it. And again, other people probably, I'd say it's probably more like people getting on with their lives as best they can, and then it's like a once a year festival that you kind of, you'll be meeting friends, but I'm doing something. But I think there are these moments where you have this reflection, and some confrontation with your illness. Which is chronic, as opposed to some illnesses are kind of an event. Maybe, I guess, if you've had a heart attack, I guess your risk of heart attack is the same in future, but it's much more of a kind of chronic illness, which goes on for a long time. So just as you didn't really ask a question, I'm not really giving you an answer.
Yeah, it's like opening the box of Pandora, what you did, and I mean, there's much more to explore. Like survivor's guilt, sacrifice, or whatever. So, and there's another guy, quite famous, Freud, who introduced the concept of thanatos. So it's let's celebrate. And celebrate. You're very